Fresh out of Alcatraz, Bumpy Johnson stepped onto the cold San Francisco pier like a man returning from the dead. The wind cut through his thin coat, but it was nothing compared to the hunger he had survived inside those stone walls. For years, racist guards had treated him less like a prisoner and more like an experiment. Meals skipped, food spoiled on purpose, weeks of starvation meant to break his spirit. They laughed as his body withered, certain that hunger would succeed where chains had failed. But what they never understood was that hunger didn't make Bumpy weak. It made him patient. Alcatraz had taken decades of his life, but it had not taken his memory. Every insult, every night he went to sleep with his stomach eating itself, every time a guard whispered hate through iron bars, it all stayed with him. Freedom didn't bring peace. It brought clarity. As the ferry pulled away from the island, Bumpy didn't feel relief. He felt focus. The guards who starved him had gone home every night, kissed their families, and slept well. Bumpy had counted rats for company. That imbalance burned hotter than any cell block punishment. Back on the streets, San Francisco felt loud and unfamiliar. The world had moved on without him. His mother was gone. Friends were buried or broken. The city didn't celebrate his return. It didn't even notice. But Bumpy noticed everything. Newspaper clippings, old records, quiet conversations in diners. He pieced together where his former tormentors had ended up. One had become a private security man. Another worked a warehouse job. One lived quietly in the suburbs, pretending the past had never happened. They thought Alcatraz was behind them. For Bumpy, Alcatraz had followed him out. The first guard didn't recognize Bumpy at first. Time and hunger had changed his face. But recognition came quickly, right after fear. The man tried to explain, to minimize what he'd done, to say he was just following orders. Bumpy listened in silence, because he had heard those same words echo through the cell blocks years earlier. When it was over, the guard finally understood something Alcatraz never taught him. Starving a man doesn't erase him. It creates something else. Word spread quietly through old circles. Former Alcatraz staff grew nervous. One was found dead. Another disappeared. Police suspected coincidence at first, then pattern. Detective reports mentioned a recently released inmate, Bumpy Johnson, but there was no proof. Bumpy moved carefully, like he had inside prison. He never rushed. Hunger had taught him how to wait. One guard begged. Another tried to fight. One even cried about his children, about his regrets, about how life had been hard for him too. Bumpy didn't take pleasure in what he was doing, but he didn't hesitate either. These men had watched him starve without mercy. Now, they were learning what mercy felt like when it was already too late. As bodies piled up, the city started whispering his name. Not loudly, not in headlines, but in back rooms and police briefings. Bumpy Johnson was free, and something was very wrong. The final guard, the worst of them all, understood before the others. He had been the ringleader inside Alcatraz, the one who decided when food was denied and when punishment became personal. When Bumpy finally found him near the docks, there were no speeches left to give, only truth. The confrontation was brutal, desperate, and messy, nothing like the fantasies of revenge people imagine. Guns were raised, words were shouted. The past collided with the present in a storm of rage and regret. When it ended, one man was dead, and the other was empty. Sirens closed in as Bumpy stood still, finally exhausted. He didn't run. The confrontation was brutal, desperate, and messy, nothing like the fantasies of revenge people imagine. Guns were raised. Words were shouted. The past collided with the present in a storm of rage and regret. When it ended, one man was dead, and the other was empty. Sirens closed in as Bumpy stood still, finally exhausted. He didn't run. He didn't resist. The hunger that had driven him forward was gone. Police put him in handcuffs. Bumpy looked up at the sky, free air filling his lungs one last time. He had survived Alcatraz. He had survived starvation. And now, he had faced the men who tried to erase him. Justice didn't feel clean. Revenge didn't feel victorious. But for the first time since those iron doors slammed shut decades earlier, the hunger was quiet. Inside Bumpy, however, a different war was unfolding. The closer he came to the end of his hunt, the heavier his steps became. Revenge had fueled him at first, but now it sat in his chest like a second hunger, one that no act of violence could truly satisfy. At night, when the city finally grew quiet, the memories returned uninvited. The clanging of cell doors, the mocking laughter of guards as trays passed every cell except his. The slow realization that starvation wasn't just physical, it was meant to erase dignity. Those memories followed him through every dark street and every confrontation. The police were no longer guessing. They knew the pattern now. Every victim had one thing in common: Alcatraz. More specifically, Alcatraz's punishment wing. Detectives traced dates, shifts, and disciplinary records, and one name kept resurfacing: Bernard Johnson. Freshly released. No family ties. No steady work. A man with nothing left to lose. To law enforcement, he was becoming a ghost story whispered through briefing rooms. A man shaped by cruelty and turned into something dangerous by neglect. The final guard, the one Bumpy had saved for last, understood the danger long before Bumpy reached him. Unlike the others, this man had never believed the past stayed buried. He had been the one who ordered the food withheld, who turned cruelty into routine, who believed power meant never being questioned. After Alcatraz closed, he told himself it was just a job, that history would forget the men behind the walls. But history had not forgotten. It had simply waited. When Bumpy finally stood face to face with him near the docks, there was no triumph in his eyes, only exhaustion. The guard tried to justify himself, just like the others had. He spoke of orders, of pressure, of the times they lived in. He said everyone was cruel back then. But Bumpy heard only excuses layered over fear. The same fear he had felt as his stomach twisted in on itself night after night. The confrontation was raw and desperate. It wasn't clean or heroic. It was two broken men colliding under the weight of the past. Gunshots echoed against the water. Wood splintered. Sirens wailed in the distance. When it was over, one man lay dying, and the other stood motionless, finally drained of purpose. The hunger that had driven Bumpy since Alcatraz, since Starvation, was gone. In its place was silence. When the police arrived, Bumpy didn't run. He didn't fight. He simply raised his hands and let the cuffs close around his wrists. Detective Lee looked at him not with anger, but with something closer to understanding. This wasn't a criminal chasing power or money. This was a man chasing closure in a world that had denied him justice. As they led him away, Bumpy lifted his eyes to the night sky. For a brief moment, he breathed freely. He had survived one of the harshest prisons in American history. He had survived starvation meant to break him, and he had faced the men who believed they could erase him without consequence. Whether history would call him a monster or a victim no longer mattered. What mattered was that the hunger was finally quiet. Bumpy Johnson returned to prison, not as a man afraid to die, but as a man who had already endured worse. And long after his name faded from police reports and newspaper headlines, the story remained. A reminder that cruelty doesn't disappear when uniforms come off. It waits, and sometimes it comes back walking free. Even as the cuffs bit into his wrists, Bumpy felt a strange sense of release. The city around him was waking up, indifferent to the storm he had just left behind. Streetlights flickered in the fog, and early vendors began unpacking crates along the piers, oblivious to the violent reckoning that had just taken place. He knew law enforcement would brand him a criminal, a murderer, a danger, but he didn't care. Every step he had taken since stepping off that ferry had been about reclaiming the years stolen from him, and that was something no badge or headline could undo. Inside him, the anger that had driven him through decades of confinement was finally giving way to something quieter, a hollow calm, tempered by grief and memories of starvation, humiliation, and survival. In the following days, the city buzzed with rumors. Detectives pored over leads, interviewed former colleagues of the guards, and pieced together what had happened to the docks. No one could fully explain how Bumpy had tracked down each man with surgical precision, how he had moved like a shadow through the streets, appearing where they least expected him. Witnesses told fractured stories. An unknown man seen outside a warehouse, a fight in the misty alley, a man helping a terrified child while chaos raged nearby. No one could imagine the weight of decades of suffering compressed into the fury of a single man. Bumpy, meanwhile, retreated into the quiet of the waterfront at night. He walked slowly along the foggy piers, listening to the water lap against the pilings, feeling the weight of both vengeance and loss. He remembered his mother, long dead, and the empty rooms of his childhood home. He thought of friends who had perished in the streets, of other prisoners who never saw the outside again. For the first time since his release, he allowed himself to feel exhaustion, not just of the body, but of the soul. His mission had been completed, but the world he returned to was unchanged, a reminder that survival doesn't guarantee peace. The police continued their hunt, but Bumpy was careful, slipping through alleys, using forgotten routes, avoiding the cameras that now dotted the city streets. He had no desire to escalate the violence. The hunger for justice that had driven him through months of planning had reached its natural conclusion. He only needed to exist in the quiet aftermath, a man shaped by pain and haunted by the memory of what had been done to him. Each night, he lit a cigarette, inhaled the bitter smoke, and let the past replay in his mind, not to fuel further revenge, but to remind himself of survival, endurance, and the cost of freedom. And yet, even as the city moved on, whispers of his name lingered. In back rooms and quiet bars, people spoke in hushed tones of the man who had emerged from Alcatraz not broken, not hollowed, but transformed. Some called him a monster, others called him a legend. He didn't seek either title. What Bumpy understood was that cruelty cannot erase the soul. It only shapes it. Those who had starved him, beaten him, and laughed at his suffering had underestimated the power of memory, patience, and endurance. In the end, Bumpy's story was more than a tale of revenge. It was a story of survival against impossible odds, of a man who endured hunger and cruelty and emerged with a single-minded resolve. The city that had once seemed so vast and intimidating now felt like a quiet witness to his journey, one that had demanded everything from him and returned only what he claimed with his own hands. The world might never understand the man who walked free from Alcatraz, who hunted the shadows of his tormentors and returned to the streets alone, but for Bumpy Johnson, understanding had never mattered. Survival had been enough.